So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. I hope everybody enjoyed Nashville so far. This is kind of home ground to me. For many years, I was down in Chattanooga, Tennessee. So today, what we're going to be talking about is project management for imaging professionals. And basically, how did I get it? Let me give you a little background of where I currently live, which is a health system called WellStar out of Marietta, Georgia. And what we are is a 9-hospital network. We've got 21 imaging centers, and some of what I do ranges back to our business. We're the 17th currently busiest emergency room in the country, the number 2 busiest emergency room in the state of Georgia. And at one point, we were the largest healthcare provider in Georgia, but we keep fluctuating back and forth between our competitor, Piedmont. So this 9 hospitals, probably by the end of the year, we'll be back up to 13 hospitals again. And that kind of ranges back to some of the stuff I talk about project management and how to be adaptable, might be the best term for it. So a little bit of the background. I've been in this since 1985, and so had a choice between going to General Motors or coming into biomed and following my older brother. Guess which one I picked? So transition, so I came from the technical ranks, became a supervisor of a level 1 trauma center called Erlanger in Chattanooga, Tennessee. So I've worked in an environment where you had a lot of money at the University of Michigan. I came to a place that had absolutely no money, which is Erlanger, which we were perpetually broke. Went back up to Michigan for a short time with McLaren Health System out, which is my site was Mount Clemens, Michigan. And basically I came back down to WellStar to work on an Epic integration project. So part of my background is computer. I basically have a computer engineering background too, so it's a couple biomed degree, a biomed degree and an electrical technology degree. So I thought this was great. If you can't explain it simply, you really don't understand it well enough. And so this was something I mentioned before. When you're talking to your audience, is your deal with, first of all, how many people are clinical here? So I got one right here. The rest of you guys are all technical, correct? Okay. This is one of my favorite ones right here about project management. So as we're talking about customers and starting this, your first interview is how the customer explained it, how the project leader understood it, how the analyst designed it, how the programmer wrote it, how the business consultant described it, how the project was documented, what operations installed, what the customer was billed for, and how it was supported. I think all of you can relate to this right now. And what the customer really wanted was, I just want a simple tire swing that works. And unfortunately, nobody paid any attention to what the customer really wanted. So here's some of the things that I want to first bring up. I want to visit the dark side. Project management statistics. Projects go over budget 27% of the time on average. 1 in 6 projects has a cost overrun of 200%. And unfortunately, this hasn't changed. 17% of IT projects go so badly that they can threaten the very existence of a company. And now, have any of you done IT projects before, like big ones? This literally is very true. And then the survey did 73% of the respondents feel that their projects are either always or usually doomed right from the start. And what happens when you do your first meetings or you're engaged in anything and the majority of your audience says, this is going to never work. We're doomed. Chances are, you're doomed. IT failure rates, and I'm not picking on IT because I've been part of IT at one point for 20 years of my career. So failure rates are between 5 and 15%, representing $50 billion to $100 billion in losses per year. And so as we're talking about some of this project management stuff, that's what I want people to think about is what can you do to prevent mitigate the risk that you put your employer in, and also the risk you put your job in. So, as we talk about project management, now one thing about me years and years ago, I got really good at putting in projects, things like that, and then few years later, I found out there's actually a formal process for doing this, which unfortunately nobody kind of enlightened me on that in my first life. So, part of what the project management, when you're initiating a project, when we think about the swing, who's initiating it? How many of you in here are basically the founder of a project? Sometimes. Okay. So what happens is, when you get the call that says, what am we going to do? What are we trying to do? It could be something in our world, like we're going to put a new MRI somewhere. Something's really big. The next phase is planning the project. There's multiple ways of people, and all these are, just in case I want to jump out real quick here. Has any of you ever heard of PMI, Project Management Institute? I've done a lot of training with that. I am not a PMI certified person yet. I plan on someday doing that. So a lot of the definitions I use, these are all generic things, but the main thing I want to do is get everybody, when you're thinking about something, the methodical process of what you're doing, and how also, from the technical standpoint, how you communicate with your clinical people, your financial people. So you have a plan. And generally, as I make the joke, if I have plan A, you better bet I have plan B. And so, because 9 times out of 10, plan B is where I'm at. So, so when we're talking about the planning phases of the project, simple thing, who do you engage in the planning process from the finance standpoint, architectural standpoint, all the different starts before this thing even becomes on a reality. Executing the project, monitoring and controlling, and one thing you're going to hear from me a lot is a project's never completed until you close it. If you start something, you have to finish it. Just like, driving your car to work. Until you get up in the morning, you start your car. When does that end? When I shut off my car and I park it. A lot of times, that final bullet point closing can come back in a lot of strange ways. And one thing I'd probably talk about in the first life, when you have a closing, who is in charge of saying this is done? 90% of the time, it is not somebody in the technical profession like biomed or medical imaging. It is whenever the person who initiated it says, you have met all my criteria, we are going to close this project now, it is done. Payments are made, everybody's happy. And also, too, feel free to, if you guys have any questions or anything like that. I'm pretty easygoing, so I believe, this should all be interactive. So as we're talking about the project life cycle, so basically the phases that a project passes through from initiation to the final closure. I keep reiterating this. Every project that begins at some point has to end. And when you're talking about the phases, there's milestones in progress of a project. And some of those will be certain deadlines you have to meet to make sure, and if you don't have a measurable value to something, then you get yourself in a lot of trouble. Like, we talk about the life cycle, what when does the initiator of the project expect this to be done? If you do, and that's the first guardrails. When are you going to start? When are you going to finish? Because if there's something, if you don't know when if it's open-ended, which nothing, I've never had an open-ended project where they said, take as long as you feel free to do it. Anybody had that luxury? No, it's pretty well defined. So stakeholders. As we begin to talk about this, the stakeholders of a project, any person, group that may be affected by the outcome of a project or decision or an activity that is a result of a project. There are many different definitions of stakeholder. Importance is they are the end users of a completed project. And some of this, as we're dealing in our world, and especially medical imaging, there's a lot of, let's put it this way, like our CEO many times, we've been tasked to, on the fly, come up. I can think of one good one we had in my past life of Erlanger. We kept going on divert. And one of our, nursing was very concerned because we kept losing ICU business to our competitors across the road. So when we had a stakeholder of that person, we would get a call and say, hey, we have this problem with diversions. What can we do to fix it? And I said, well, the one thing we can do is we can build another ICU. And we got a call and said, where? And we walked down to a gymnasium, and our leadership at the time said, right here. And I was like, what? And so, and what the financial decision of that was, the time frame we had, the stakeholders of that, we had our nursing leadership, our CEO. So some of the people who are funding this, and unfortunately, when you're dealing with some of this stuff, you don't have what you would like to have for money or resources. You have basically, I call it, somebody was sitting in an office and said at 5 o'clock, hey, guess what? And so the stakeholder, our CEO and director of nursing, we said, hey, we will do whatever we can to research this and try to make it happen. Sponsors, we're talking about that, the person who's going to come up with, a person or possibly a group that provides resources and support for the project, the controlling money, who's got the cash? And one of the problems I had in one of my lives was the cash of this. You could have a sponsor, but anytime we needed cash, we had to go to a board of directors, or our funding. So we had a city, county, state entities, plus our hospital. So we basically had 4 groups of people that you would have to ask for money before you could even get anywhere started in this. And so changes, there's always an old saying, I could always ask for less. I could never ask for $1 more on my part of, and one thing to remember too is when we're talking about sponsors and money, I can only control what's in my world. I can't control other people's components like construction, things like that. And like I said, higher administration, sometimes government agencies even. Any of you have to deal with government agencies routinely? Yeah, it is not fun. So what was that one? Oh yeah, there you go, the VA. We are the government agency. And that's, I can just think, jumping back to my level 1 trauma center, literally having a call from the council people or the state representative would literally I've never dreamed of this in my first life. Call me on the phone and say, hey, I'd like to talk to you about something. And it's like, me? And it's like, okay, this is,
Well, that was at your county hospital, right?
yeah,
So it's a county hospital, so it was treated
a lot differently.
versus WellStar.
Oh yeah, well, in my first life, the University of Michigan, I always made a joke that, even at the time, when I left there, we had $1 billion in the bank to run operations. And there was always, I've kind of made the joke, there's basically a bowl. People have the candy bowl when they, visit a house or something. The candy bowl in my first life was full of money. And if you just needed a few extra million, you just reach into the bowl and grab it. There's very little, it was a good thing in one way, but a bad thing in another way, because how do you even explain to somebody, we can't really do that because we don't have the money, and then somebody goes over and goes, oh, by the way, we do. We do? Where? And so the project manager, and this was something as we talked about, who's designated to run, like as you're talking about a project? What person, entity? I've served never as a full project manager. I've run my lane of the project. And I kind of look at it as, you think of a freeway that's got 10 lanes on it, everybody's assigned a lane. IT, construction, everything like that. Somebody, unfortunately, has to make sure everybody's not colliding with each other. And that's that poor soul right there, the project manager. And so the rest of us, the group of individuals who support this person, and they are the leader of the project. And this is something that a lot of people will try to overrun at times. And so they make assignments. Sometimes it's not, depending on the person too, because there's different personalities with project managers. The most successful ones I've learned are basically the easiest going ones, the ones who can adapt to a change, who don't come down as, there are times when you want to be firm in the things you're doing, and there's other times that you have to adapt. And the person that can adapt to basically, that situation is probably the most successful project managers I've ever worked with. And also too, that team, I can speak to many times, the teams like working with that person. So when they come up and say, I've got something going on, everybody's usually all in. If you run into the other version, the next thing everyone goes like, I really don't want to work with this person. And I think we've all had that situation. Scope. Work done to deliver a product or a service. So basically, what are we trying to do? The baseline of what's being asked to be completed, there should be some sort of defined parameters, who's doing it, certificate of need, things like that, to ensure a project is completed and meets the desired objectives. Now, I've had a few interesting ones where the scope of a project, unfortunately, and I talk about the adaptability, was when we had our call, was we need you to create an emergency room across town in a site that doesn't exist with no blueprints. Just go down to the existing emergency room, figure it out, and within 48 hours, let me know what you come up with. And it was like, so I did know one scope. I knew we were making an emergency room. I knew where it was going to be, but that's where, as we're talking about doomed to fail, fortunately that one wasn't doomed. It did come to fruition, but there are a lot of painful lessons we all learned in that one, obviously.
Hold on one second.
Yeah.
Scope should also be defined well before the project kicks off.
Yes, it should. No, and you're exactly right. And I'll loop back to that emergency room. Or not emergency room. I'm going to loop back to that ICU, and that was basically a request was we need 8 beds. And then as they talked about it, well, it'd be nice if we had 10, maybe 12. I took a day off, and I came back, and they said, we need 12. And I said, 12? And the fortunate part with that was I had the floor plan, and some of the things that you need to learn, like in our profession, like the technology-wise, understanding the rules and regulations about what is the distance between, like in an open ICU, which is something that, do any of you remember the old wards back in the day? Oh yeah. We used to have patients lined up in an open area. There is a certain amount of distance you have to have between each person. And the simple way to look at it is there's certain variables. That wall may not move. This wall may move. But no matter what, if you can't fit that amount in there, you become a problem. But the good news was everyone settled on 10, which was good. But we'll talk more about that in a little bit because there are a lot more. That's if you've ever heard me before, that is what I affectionately call my eBay ICU. It was all the equipment was 100% bought off a version of eBay from multi-vendors. So we're talking about scope. What's the money? Who's got it? How much do you have? Tools. Do you even have the equipment to do this? As I've had the full gauntlet of, we're not expected to do much of anything that's contracted out, to we're expected to do a whole bunch of stuff. I started my career at the Detroit Medical Center where we pulled all of our own wiring. Before all this ceiling permit stuff that came about. Does anybody remember those days when you need a wire from there to there? Who's going to do it? Our own people. Before facilities came in, really came into this. People, one of the most important things I've ever had, the people. In my vision, my team. That's the most important group I have. Materials. What do you need to do what do you need to complete your task? Data. Is there any data that supports what you're trying to do? I use that example of the ICU. What are we losing? How much money are we losing? Or how many patients are diverting that we could be having, any type of data with that. I'm just picking a simple data set. Relationships, one of the relationships I've been fortunate with in a lot of my profession is the relationships internally and also the relationships I have with vendors. And I don't mean they relate, there's different forms of relationships just like in life. You have a relationship with your spouse. You'll have a relationship with your kids. You'll have a relationship with your neighbor. So it's just understanding what you expect from people. We're talking about human resources. This is what gets us in a lot of trouble. The internal staffing, what do you have available to you? External staffing, do you need people? Vendor resources, I've had really great vendor resources and I've had really sorry vendor resources. And so part of the problem is if you do need the middle one right there, external staffing, if you're VA, you may have access, shifting people from site to site, you may not have access to that. Or you may have something simple as labor, where do you, in our current environment, speaking from our standpoint, where do you get competent help today? 20 years ago, there was a whole big pool of people out there you could tap on the shoulder, bring them in. Today, that group of people has dwindled to about this. And a lot of people just don't want to come back into the hospitals anymore. Bear with me here, I just want to make sure. track of my time here because I don't want to have you guys miss the vendor, all the cool stuff out there, okay? So relationships, we already talked about this. One of the things I was actually known for was set a standard of external interactions, who does what. One of the things we used to do is we had everything that came in, we received it. And why we did something like that was before I joined one of my companies, they had a count of 27 pallets of equipment. Unfortunately, they didn't move the 27 pallets completely off the truck. 3 pallets somehow remained on the truck. And so when they went off, now nobody knew this until about a week or so later, because number one, you'd made one mistake, you did your count, but you did your count before it went on your dock. So that semi happened to roll around for 8 months with $400,000 of CPUs on it. Because trailers tend to switch from place to place to place to place. So they eventually did find it, from what I heard, someplace out in Washington State. But the problem became, who does, I'm just using the example of income inspection, initial inventory. Who's responsible for that? Because once you as the agent of the hospital sign that, yes, I agree, everything was here, it becomes your financial liability. Because I remember a very good example, I won't use the hospital, but up in Michigan, they lost a competitor, lost a bunch of equipment. Fast forward 8 years, somebody was running a bulldozer around a landfill. And they happened to hit a bunch of boxes on a pallet. And it turns out it was their whole patient monitoring system they had lost many years before. And so I won't mention who it was, but it was one of those moments where they had it in a non-secured location. Somebody just came by and wasn't thinking and said, this is where we pick up our garbage. And it went literally in the dumpster. Lock, stock, and barrel. So this really, it doesn't sound important, but, there's a lot of horror stories of that. Timelines was mentioned before. Timelines, you set up a base schedule for all the team members to follow. It's not you can't determine if you're on time if you don't track time. It's the bottom line with that. So bear with me on some of this stuff. Oh, this is always a fun one. Project management software. Have anybody of you guys used this before? Cool. I'm glad to see the nod of the heads. Does everybody in your group use the same software? Hopefully, yes. That answer, hopefully I'm seeing it. So, these are really nice. I used to have a really nice picture that I couldn't get to transmit over, but we had basically a timeline that was created by one of my former, basically managers who oversaw everything. And it'd be on the board every Wednesday we'd meet, and you could look at a whiteboard just like that was completely updated, and you could see every single project that was basically in his control with every timeline. It was beautiful, because even before he would open his mouth, you could walk in and go, here's where I should be, and all of a sudden also too, here's where I'm not. And so, team member tracking of projects, getting all your people, external and internal, to track everything they're doing. Microsoft Teams, everyone today is on, we're on Teams all the time. I don't know how we existed without Microsoft Teams, back in 30 years ago. And again, how do we exist without a cell phone? Everyone, one of the biggest problems even today, the bottom line, verify everyone is included on any important communications. Even to this day, I will see it routinely where somebody misses somebody. And it's not somebody who has a little interest in it, it's usually the person who needed to know the information the most. So make sure you're watching for that. And this is always my favorite one, risk. Yeah, risk analysis. In the event of a condition happens, positive or negative effect on one or more of the project's objectives. You know, the risks, there's all sorts of little pieces in here. You know, I left like breakdown structure. You can go out to Google, check that out. How much risk do your sponsor take on? In my current life, WellStar is ultra conservative. They are risk adverse, you know, back when I started there. I was on the other end though, where I've had places where I worked that were very risk, you know, risk didn't bother them at all. And there is no such thing as no risk. What we have to realize is, no matter where you come from, the culture of who you're, you know, basically your audience that you're working with, it may even be like, thinking on WellStar, certain groups will have more of an appetite for taking a chance than other groups. And I already know that. If they're adverse to risk, I may mention it just briefly, and I'll just say, you know, no problem, move on, it's done. Goals and meeting notes. You know, document the process, document assignments, document changes, clarification of understanding. Never, ever agree to something in a hallway without following up to somebody to say, is this what you really said? Because remember that first slide where I had the cute tire swing? That's what happens when you have a conversation with somebody. Never does it, I don't think I've ever had one conversation that was 100% right where I put it in an email and said, is this what we talked about? Well, yeah, mostly. So, defining aspects of a project. So, now, actually real quick, I want to go back on the general discussions thing. When we were talking about my infamous vapor emergency room, one of the things that I was assigned to was to come up with, from the patient monitoring standpoint, what are some of the things you need for patient monitoring, that besides the monitor, obviously. Where do you mount it? Where do you have your power? Where do you have your network capabilities? And so clarification, that actually came in to play in a good way and in a bad way. Is when we built that, I was told to build it with a certain amount of devices. It came back and they said, we don't have that kind of money. I said, okay. And they said, eliminate this many of those monitors. And I said, I don't really feel comfortable with this because one of the people that was missing from that project team was the head of the emergency department. I had never met him. So months and months, this project actually lasted 4 years, believe it or not, from that first initial budget. It went on hold, certificate of need, and then all of a sudden they realized their CON was going to basically vaporize. So then it became a 911. So the first time I met the doctor, he said, I understand I've got, just pick the number, remember, I've got 15 monitors, bedside monitors. And I just kind of was quiet for a minute there. I used to carry a big binder with me, and I'd have people sign off my binder. Anytime somebody did a change or something on me, I would make them sign it and date it. And I always kept that binder around. Nowadays, emails are a lot better. But the thing was, I said, well, actually, you have 8. And I said, that's the bad news. I said, the good news is when they told me to lose the 7 monitors, I didn't take out any of the wiring, didn't take out any of the power, didn't take out any of the network capabilities. So I said, all you have to do now is go ask for this much money to do this. So that was one of those ones where it could have worked out that I got myself into a little bit of trouble, but I did exactly what I was told. They said, lose 7 patient monitors. They didn't say lose the wiring, lose the mounts, everything like that. I said, I did, you know, and I used to have interesting conversations with one of our building managers. It's like, that's not what I meant. I said, but that's what you said. And remember when you signed this book right here? So that goes good and bad. I still have a good relationship with him. I haven't worked with him he's long retired. You know, that's the one thing I've always had. Most of the people 95% of the people I've ever worked with, I can talk to them 20 years later. I've always had a good relationship with them. Critical path, a sequence of activities that define the longest path through a project. While any process that interrupts the critical path will have a global impact. Guess what? You leave that equipment on a semi, before you even started, you have derailed your whole thing. Your whole project is not doomed, but it's delayed until you come up with an idea. Scope creep, one of my favorite things. Everyone said scope. This is our arch nemesis. Uncontrolled expansion of a project. You know what, the main issue of this, the project expands provisions that were not made or how this change was to be funded. Where are you going to get the money? You know, your resources, the bad thing is, when I mentioned team members' resources, in one life I was very fortunate because I could bill back to a project. The problem was, I put money, I said, how much money do I need to pay my people out of this project? And if I estimated wrong, that resource, all of a sudden, I've eaten more than my allocation of the money. You know, the timelines of a scope creep, basically you've thrown it out the window. Because depending on how bad this creep is, I made that example, 8 beds, 10 beds, 12 beds, 10 beds. We had 90 days to finish that project. Our hard stop was, let's see, I think it was about May, I was notified of this. July 31st, that complete gymnasium had to be an ICU. No ifs, ands, or buts. The good news is with the creep, though, we managed to not go outside of we actually did knock out a whole other department of the hospital, believe it or not. The neighbors next door ended up having to get relocated because we creeped past those initial 8 beds that we did need to avoid that diversion. Change in life is everything changes. You know, determine the path of the project must take a different direction than originally planned. You know, change of the project cost, any timelines. You know, scope creep and change at least takes a direction. Scope creep I consider is like a spider's web. You start following one out here, and all of a sudden it goes over here, it goes over here, and until somebody completely puts it back on a track, you never know where it's going to end. You know, compression, crashing, fast tracking. I'll let you take a look at those for a second. I won't read them verbatim. You know, crashing is one of the more fun things. You know, fast tracking, dysfunctional. How many people have been in a dysfunctional project? More than I want to talk about. You know, and the biggest thing here, the only one I'll read, a technique used to ensure success is not an option. Because on the dysfunctional ones, those are the ones that never see an end. Or it's that wing of the building that everyone kind of looks at and goes, why did that never get finished? It was dysfunctional. Acceptance criteria, remember that. You know, conditions that must be set for deliverables to be signed off. One of the issues I had in my first life was we built the biggest hospital in the state of Michigan when I was a 22-year-old kid. we had a strict criteria for each vendor, and they said, you will read every bid pack, you will hold a vendor to that criteria. One of the worst ones I had was, I was in charge of a sleep lab bid. I came through, and when they did the bid, they forgot to mention one thing when I was doing the testing. To test the camera system, I turned off the lights in the room. And you know what happened to all the monitors in the room? They all went black. Because somebody forgot to put these need to function in a no light environment. It's a sleep lab. So I went back to the vendor and I said, this is unacceptable because this, it doesn't work. And they said, but read right here. We delivered exactly what you told us. Not me, but my administrators. So guess what I had to do? Begrudgingly, I had to say, yes, they have met the criteria with the caveat of this system will not work because of. And so when you're, grand total at 22 years old, you've got your degrees, you're figuring, how is this going to work out for my career? My first job. But unfortunately, now we did have one other bad side with this. We had a nurse call system that everything was supposed to be modular. The vendor ignored it and turned it into hardwire. We said you're not going to get signed off until you do it right. Somebody up above us, the vice president, said, all is forgiven. All you guys who have been doing the punch list for all these vendors, everything is signed off. 10 years later, my group had to completely rewire, basically put connectors on to modularize that whole nurse call system at hundreds of hours. I was very fortunate because I had a group of people that, were highly skilled. Also, we all needed money. We were young, but we accepted things we didn't want to get. Planning installation, understanding the scope, timeline. We already talked about all this stuff. Routine update times are scheduled. Biggest thing on that bottom one, anybody who schedules a meeting, make sure you attend it. If you don't attend it, let them know why. Because I've got one right now, we're doing practice acquisitions, and for something as simple as buying a doctor's office, there's 45 of us on this meeting. And unfortunately, my little tidbit is about 30 seconds, but they do notice when you're not there. So at least if your little icon pops up on Microsoft Teams, they're recording it and saying, when they do the roll call down of each person, show up. If you don't show up, then you hear the snide comments of, oh, everybody showed up by that other group. Or I took a day off last week and basically to meet a pod for a storm-damaged house. First thing I heard the next day was from that same group, hey, Greg, where were you at yesterday? And I was like, yeah, I had to take the day off. And they were like, you're good anyways, because I always was on every other meeting, and when I wasn't there, they noticed I was missing. Okay, remember I told you, here's the 3 terms I came up to build a project. Long-term, short-term, build it to fit. That build it to fit's the hardest. Set amount of money, you can't be increased. I just keep track of my time here. Oh, we got plenty of time. Okay, we're 45. So has anybody had, can you relate to this?
I'll give you 1978 in the Navy. I was on the project management team to build the new Navy hospital in San Diego. And I had a single line item in my massive $90 million worth of equipment that said computer. And it started at $20,000 for the hospital. And over the course of 10 years of planning, that grew to millions. And we didn't know what a computer was. We just kept putting money there. Going, it's going to be something, and we're going to need it.
No, and it's true. You're absolutely right. And when I said that long-term one, that when I use that emergency room as my best example was, they would never tell me when this was going to happen. But all I knew was I had less than 48 hours to make an estimate of all my labor, all my equipment, all my infrastructure on my end. So what I did was I went list price, and I said, you know what, I'm just going to bank on 5 years. So I took the net present value of money, and I said, I'm going to keep increasing list price over that time. And then as I'm, people who knew me made a joke, I buried one of my little bodies in it. So I had a little bit of a slush fund in there just in case. So 4 years down the road, when I got the call back, it said, hey, remember that estimate you did? And I'm thinking, which estimate? Oh, the emergency room. Oh, you mean the one that doesn't exist? My budget was the only one that I just squeezed by, but because I just said I'm not going to go with what we charge, because we did get big discounts. Good example is that computer. You don't know what a computer is. Boom, that probably went up exponentially over that time period. And if somebody was holding you to a dollar figure, it's unfair, number one, to put somebody in a situation like that. That's just, But the truth of the matter is, we've all been put in that situation. Some of this, we've already discussed. Newer and existing area. Biggest thing back in the old days, asbestos. If you're dealing with old buildings, like some of the stuff I've dealt with in years gone by, if it's an existing area, you better know what you're walking into. Oh, and this is my favorite one. Are you attempting to reuse anything without checking? I spent my 40th birthday when my family had a party, because my original, I won't blame the person, but he asked, can we put a telemetry system in? Being cheap, can we reuse the antenna infrastructure for our system, a wide area telemetry system? And that was one of my things that I did in my first life. The answer is yes, you can, but no, you shouldn't. And the answer was, and the simple reason why was, that system had been, for lack of a better term, butchered over several generations and expanded. So what happened was 10 years later, as the system was end-of-lifing, it had a catastrophic failure and wiped out a whole floor of telemetry patients. So the answer was, when I talked to the vendor rep, he said, well, I said, you could. His answer exactly was that. Yeah, you can reuse it, but you shouldn't. And because they use that term can, that actually all the problems they had over all the years where we get service calls were because of that system, because we had power supplies running to a kitchen that were powering the system from another vendor that didn't need to be there. Nobody bothered to go up and run the cables to chase the ceiling to see where everything went. Big thing, how much do you have to pay up front? How much money is committed on arrival? How much money is a final approval? When I was talking that first life, until I signed off, the vendor did not get 50% of their money. How long it takes this is actually, depending on which employer I had, or actually with one of my employers, I used to pay all my bills on time. A different CEO came in, and he decided to float money for 90 to 120 days. So I went from being a good customer to being a bad customer in a matter of a short period of time. Because people will ask you, when are you going to pay your bill? Blueprint control, we had basically that call, and they came up with a good idea. Everybody had to make sure they had the same revision of the blueprints, back in the day. estimate, revision control. I mentioned my notebook back in the day. I still do keep a lot of paper notes, but I keep a lot of virtual notes. Shared access. Make sure everybody can get to anything important. This is the biggest thing that I've had through. A lot of people have asked me, before you do something, before you lead on something, make sure that you have the bandwidth of your life. If you've got small kids, things like that, there's a yin and yang in life. If you're working overtime, there's something else that you're giving up in your life. Communication ability. More times in life, people will crash because it's not what you say, it's how you say it that matters. And there's an old saying, remember people said when you get really mad, you type up the email, and you go like, I'm going to count to 20 before I hit the send button. Or sometimes I'm just not even going to send that because how you term it, when you're in the heat of the moment, is how somebody may perceive you for years. Patience. Can't tell you how many times, being patient is just having that ability to let, somebody, if they're having a bad day, don't feed into somebody else's bad day. Sometimes you may have to let things go. Internal debate, we already talked about this. Unfortunately, in my current life, they're still trying to figure out how to do this. Because I had mentioned that at WellStar, we had the ability to go right into a time clock and transfer into our kitty of money. Have a plan. That's my biggest thing. Know what you're expected of. Know the boundaries of your role. Remember I said that 10-lane freeway? Don't do your best to stay within your boundaries. Don't take on tasks you're not ability to control. Don't make time promises you can't keep. Have a contingency plan. If somebody doesn't have a system administrator for their brand new PAC system, just because you can do it, it doesn't mean you should do it. Because once you start volunteering for stuff, then all of a sudden your staff gets really unhappy with you. Common pitfalls. Let me do a quick time check here. Okay, so we're still good. Purchasing equipment without user input. That is probably, I can't tell you how many times somebody has gone out and just bought something that they're at a conference, this thing looks great, they bring it in and the person goes, who did you ask to buy it? Well, it's a great deal. Just because it's a good deal doesn't mean it's the right deal. Joining late in a project, approaching involvement as a reactive versus a proactive. One of the things is if you get sucked into something and you're reactive, remember what I said in those first slides of the project that's doomed? If you get dragged into something and the first response you have is, we're all doomed. We're, kind of like the airplane thing where everybody screams, we're all gonna die. You don't wanna be the person that says, we're reactive versus saying, okay, we'll regroup and we're gonna see what we can do to, life gives you lemons. What's the old saying? You make lemonade. And then in the case of Ron White, you find your best friend who has vodka, sometimes. So, few you got that one. So not taking the time to properly verify information, details and context. That is some of the things, not taking the time for measurement verification. We just had an instance like that where we were installing a cysto table. If you looked at the specs and you looked at the blueprint of the area we were putting in, it was probably cleared by inches. The problem is when you have something like that and it is so close, you need to go backwards and say, okay, we need to make sure that this print or this area is really what we say it is. And what finally happened with that one instance was it became a finger pointing thing where they went to put it in, and it wasn't the actual device was the problem, the cysto table was. It was the controls that they needed for this room. And what happened was they had to cobble out a 9 square foot section of that area. And some of the, remember I was talking about the old buildings and things like that? One of the things we did when we purchased a bunch of tenant hospitals, WellStar did, right before I got there. Some of these hospitals were pretty old. You know, one of them that we did shutter was actually, everybody remember the Cuban Missile Crisis? Probably before your birth, some of us, you know. It was a bomb shelter in case they fired missiles, nuclear missiles, at that section of Atlanta. So if that just gives you a scope of some of the buildings we had. My, not only measurement verification, what was the building designed to hold? In one of my lives, and up, you know, it's Erlanger, we have this beautiful building that was called the 38 building. You know why it's called the 38 building? It was built in 1938. It housed our cath lab. What happened was we moved to a newer area, and it came to the point of somebody said, we've got this great area. The bad thing about this whole structure was built was the umbilical cords of the whole system went through this one building, so you could not knock down this building because it took out your power, your HVAC, everything. What they did decide to do was they're going to try to put a server farm, and they started to slowly build this in the old cath lab. Then what happened was, I can't remember at what point it was, but computer equipment is a lot heavier and denser than imaging equipment. They began to realize that the floor underneath it was going to give way. So when we're saying measurement verification, engage your structural engineers, yeah, you need to do that. In the case of like going back to that Dornier table, everything did work out. How long did it get delayed? About a month. So the clinical people, all those people that were going to have procedures guaranteed down there, the unfortunate part was our next facility was 30 miles away. So that became the next thing is customer satisfaction. Lack of engagement with clinical staff. You know, making changes without approvals. Remember I said I had somebody who always email, signature, make sure somebody approves what you're doing. As we keep going, common pitfalls, continue deliberately working outside your areas of responsibility. You know, unfunded equipment replacements. Now this came back, now this was an interesting one, and this is depending on how your hospital does things. VA has strict guidelines on what you can and can't do. One of the things that you run into is when this is a common, basically problem with almost every system I put in. It's, you know, capitalizing operational money. And so, is anybody familiar with that concept at all? Yep, I see a few heads. And this came back when I started this job at WellStar. We bought a lot of portable systems from CareStream. We got a great deal on point of sale agreements that were bundled in with this project. The unfortunate part was when this came in, there was a group of people who all signed off on this. As time went on, that group of people was all gone or, you know, reassigned. The person I took over for was a 40-something-year-old rad tech, 40-year seniority. Great guy. Unfortunately, I never knew this existed. So when we came back to, you know, the consignment or how you budget things, nobody knew they were liable for hundreds of thousands of dollars of service contracts. So then you had to come back to each and every single department and say, oh, by the way, you actually did pay for this, you just didn't know you paid for this. Consignment, there's an old saying in life, nothing's free. Depending on, if you get things on, per use agreements. What happens if that equipment disappears? So how did you manage to, whatever it is, whatever system it is? How do you resolve that? Quick purchases, only a device, not all the pieces. This has been an interesting one that still keeps on going to this day. You don't get all the parts to make this what you thought you were buying when you promised the physician is not what you actually got. So as things get installed, day one, it goes like, here's what I'm trying to do. IR labs. Oh, by the way, I want to do this. Well, that wasn't discussed, but that's what I did at my other hospital when you recruited me. Interfacing non-compatible equipment. Imaging complications. Did the site ever have imaging equipment? This has been a big deal lately. Also, too, I had an interesting, fun one actually, as I was talking about that physician's practice. Now that I've gone out to the medical group and because they actually beat their own drum. They're a separate entity at WellStar, the doctors. I've had a couple times where, it was about 3 weeks ago, the director of all of the facilities goes, we're getting this practice in this area, and by the way, Greg, you on the line? I said, yeah. He goes, I got great news. I've got a 1973 x-ray system for you. And remember I said at that moment, keep your microphone on mute? And I just, my boss was on the line, and I said, I typed to her on Teams, did I hear that right? And lo and behold, it was a 1973 x-ray system, which, how many people bet I condemned that within the first 3 seconds of seeing it? It was condemned. It did still work, but one of the catches, what I learned as we've been getting these people, one of the things I'll hear from my radiologists, basically my rad techs is, I get this to work, but I have to use a little more technique. And I use that analogy of, I can start my car as long as I put the key in the on position, I go out to the right front fender, and I kick it. Then everything works great. And so that was interesting, but they already knew that we were going to condemn it, but that was just one of those funny moments. And I've actually got some pictures that I never, share the horror stories of the pictures. Oh, God. Well, one of the things you have to realize when I was talking about project management, if anybody thinks back to 1973, and I'll use something, if you think of cars, how many airbags were there in cars in 1973? 0. So when seatbelts were an option in a car in the 1960s. As I went out there, and that's one of the things I said, the importance of showing up. When I heard that, my first alarm bell went off, and I said, okay, everybody's going out to this site on this date. Did I want to drive, 45 miles through Atlanta traffic to go to the site? No. But did I know if I did not go there and meet when everybody was meeting there, I'd lose my opportunity to point out things to them? What did I find in that system? Bolts were missing in the unistrut. First thing I looked up in the air, there's a bolt missing. Oh, crap. Next thing is, I've got exposed wires. Next thing is, I call it the umbilical cord. Had been, basically the sheathing had been pulled back to the culminator head, and they had just used tape to hold it up over the ears. And so when I started taking pictures of this, sent it to my boss, and I said, you already knew I was going to condemn this, but here's why it hit. And the other catch was, and I still haven't found out, was there a requirement back in the day to mount the overhead unistrut? Could you mount it to the wood, or did you have to put a fixed, like I-beam in? Because actually at one of my lives, we bought a physician's practice, and the x-ray company who installed the system basically did not do a shielding design. They mounted it to the wood rafters. So the first time we went out there, you know, and the catch is and this is something I didn't realize, you know, back in my early life, is you always made this assumption doctors' offices were held to the same standard that hospitals were in our naive world, in my naive world. They're not. But what happens is once they become they put the marquee on that your employer, you're at a different, let me see if I can get this thing to quit doing that. You're at a different level. Because at that point, it's no longer Dr. Smith's practice. In this life, it's WellStar. And so you have a different bar. Who has access to shielding designs? Who keeps them? You know, we're moving a CT from a building we're shuttering down. We were looking for a shielding design from 2007. It wasn't going to happen because we just wanted to have a baseline of what it was. It doesn't exist. But we had to have a new shielding design anyways because it's a different CT. You know, remember I said consideration for the weight of the equipment? You know, how did you get the equipment in the building? This may not seem like a big deal, but I know we inherited an MRI. And I got a call from my boss, you know, basically a text from my boss that said, can you lose an MRI? And I said, you know what? I'm not sure if they got a volume on this, but what do you mean lose an MRI? She said, well, we bought a physician's practice. There's an MRI sitting in that building. It's leased. So eventually they were going to get rid of that lease, and what's going to happen is that MRI then became a liability because we would have to pay for that lease until that MRI disappeared. And so how do they get the equipment in the building? They rolled the building across the street, craned the MRI, and unfortunately I found a company in Atlanta that had done it. Long story short, I managed to get the MRI. It had been quenched once, not working, as near as I could tell, 3 years before, hit by lightning twice, and I managed to get it out of the building for a net cost of $0. Because when I first heard it, I said, there's no way we're going to get this removed for less than 5 figures. And I said, I can't even give you guys an estimate on that. Because we had to unbolt the side of the building, lift the side of the building off, and the long story short was we ended up selling it through .med. Half of it went to Greece, the other half went to Italy, and we were budget neutral. And I said, and you know, sometimes in life, it's not, if you just didn't spend the money, you're a success. And somewhere down the line, when we get rid of that lease, they've got that, and like I said, that second lightning strike was something else because it actually caught the power panel on fire. But nobody knew the magnet got quenched for 3 years, believe it or not. So how do you get it back out again? I can talk about how many people are stuck with an MRI in a building they can't get back out again.
There's one here in Nashville, Premier Radiology's got an open MRI. They built a bank around it. They blocked the wall and they slid it in. It weighs 40 tons. And they built a deck around the back end for employees. So they have to demolish the building to get this Toshiba open MRI. This is right now.
Yeah, and that's.
So you're close in all your examples.
Yeah.
There are pursuit buildings out there that are ancient old hospitals.
And
it's a big deal to do renovations.
And we've got the same similar issue. We had to, unfortunately, through events, we had to shut down our level 1 trauma center, Atlanta Medical Center, down in Atlanta, Georgia. At the time, we were planning, when I took my job, I know they were planning on replacing the MRI. they were still planning on we were working completely towards replacing the MRI in that building because we were installing new equipment up until 2 weeks before they announced we're shutting this place down. Now what happened with that MRI is we can get it out again. The problem is now you have to shut down basically the road in front of this building if you pull it out with a crane, and we hit the point of, my director, my VP said, we are not going to take this out of the building. And so the two choices I said was, well, we can contact people because it still works and say, sell it as parts. But the other catch is anybody ever tried to cut an MRI into pieces? That is, it can be done, but there are so many regulations and stuff you have to do that what it's eventually going to probably end up doing is just sitting where it's at. And because that building, as far as we're concerned, will never be a hospital again. It'll be like you're saying with that one that's built around, the deck's built around and everything. It's, it will unfortunately meet its demise by somebody else. But, the catch is, I know at the University of Michigan we didn't know what an MRI was. Basically, when I started there, it was like a new thingy. But they did make provisions to, as you're coming down a hallway that was about this wide, every time there's a fire door, you could remove the upper panels. And you could basically, even though, and I thought this was brilliant, when this was originally designed, MRIs did exist when I started in this profession, but when this building was built, it was kind of like probably something you saw in Popular Mechanics or something out in, some of these research areas. But they did have a plan to get this stuff in and out. So when you're, it may be, simplest way I look at it, how do you get it back out and nothing lasts forever? Sometimes you have to remove them not because you want to, because you have to. The FDA has all of a sudden come up with some reason that this thing is dangerous. Anybody ever had, go ahead.
I was going to say that Navy Hospital, they're on San Diego to this day, because that's the current hospital there now. We opened it in 1990. We did great with putting money for computers. Our great oops was we never even knew about MR. And to this day, MR lives in corporate buildings on the backside of the hospital because there was no space for it in the building. And it's 1 million square feet, but no MR lives behind the building.
And one of the things I was considered fortunate in my early career is when we were building that hospital, at the University of Michigan, it was called RHP at the time, we were assigned to work through each bid pack. Each one of our group of technicians, we were all fresh college grads. And what happened was we had to work with a construction manager out of Detroit. It was called Barton Mallow. And what happened was sometimes they'd go with you on your bid to do the count or do the acceptance testing or something. And the fortunate part I would do is, I'd go over there and I knew I had to meet with him, but we'd have to go through something to do something else before he got to me. And also that was back in the days, these wonderful things of cell phones. When you're in a big building that's 600 beds, how do you communicate? There is no such thing as a cell phone. So it was line of sight when you were dealing with people. And what I learned from there is I would go through areas and he'd be like specking floors. And he'd go like, well, here's how much rebar we put in a floor. Because he'd be checking contractors and I'd pay attention to, here's our IT closet. Here's our fire, and I'd just ask, a question like, what are you doing? And I learned a lot just by paying attention to what he was doing. And even to this day, I know where the demolition charges would have to go in that building to knock it down. Because the prior building that it replaced was built in 1926. It had to be knocked down by a ball. Can anybody ever watch a 13-floor building come down with a wrecking ball? It is a sight to behold. This is one of my favorite ones. 5 ways to get it done wrong or not at all. Scopeless is hopeless. Don't decide what you're doing, just throw money at it. Always works. Anything in life, just throw money at it. Focus on time and cost, not quality. Get it done yesterday. Never let anyone spend any money. Don't waste time checking on anything, just get it done. Know the right thing to do. Don't pay any attention to that. Don't analyze the problems. Don't listen to an expert. And absolutely above all, whatever you do, be sure to ignore the customer. You wouldn't launch a project if you didn't know everything. And what does anyone else know? Biggest thing is, you remember I mentioned, I still remember that guy's name all these years later, 40 years later. Every now and then I'll remember his flashback of his name, but his first name was Russ. And Russ is probably, if he was still alive today, would probably be close to 100 years old. Don't thank the team. This is the biggest thing that people do. We used to have meetings, and people made a joke, because I always would say there's something we could, if I thought we did something perfect, I wasn't looking close enough. I always was thankful to my team, all the sacrifices they made. Never keep pushing them. Don't waste time with planning. People ought to know what to do. People don't know what to do, and if you make that assumption, you don't. I've been very fortunate in my career. I don't lose a lot of employees. We like working together. Just tell the team to get it done or else. Now, I have had bosses that have done that. But also, too, I never let that rein back to my team. Because if anybody's going to have to put up with that, it should be, there's an old saying, if you're the leader, what's the definition? You lead. Don't let your team, because it gets real easy to get that toxic environment where people feel like, I've put all this work in, blood, sweat, extra hours, and you don't appreciate me. And that's the hardest thing, when you don't feel appreciated. Avoid the big problems. All of our projects fail. Remember I said that? We've got no time for them either. We're too busy putting out fires. Just from the CMMS standpoint, that's one of my other expertises. CMS is, it's an old saying, if you don't document it, it didn't happen. And I've had numerous, when I was a technician, I had people saying, I'm doing such great work, but I didn't document a darn thing. And thank you everyone for attending. Do you guys have any questions? Oh, come on.
You got coffee cards to hand out?
No, the beer tokens are later, I think. John occasionally gives me the beer token. Yeah, I don't have them yet. I have to hit the boss for that.